Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stephanie Ann Again. I am your host, Stephanie Brinkerhoff, and I am here to talk about all things deconstruction, spiritual crisis, psychedelics, Jungian psychology, and basically just my process of discovering who I am again and again after a lifetime in Mormonism. I tend to be a very uncurated person, so much of this podcast is stream of consciousness style. I aim to create a space of vulnerability and human-to-human connection by sharing personal stories and real-life experiences rather than just sharing information. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode. Today I'm going to be talking about all things attachment, codependency, the myth of the magical other. This is like the world that I have been swimming in for the last several years, but mostly for my entire life. I mean, our society in general is incredibly codependent. And I think Mormonism, for those who come from that background, is like an added level of that because you have this weird, like, codependent relationship with Mormon God. And when I first started learning about codependency, I think there's that one book that's really popular, like Codependent No More or something like that. And it focuses a lot on like the partners of people who have addiction problems, substance abuse and stuff like that. And I read part of that and I was kind of like, this isn't really, I didn't quite understand what it was trying to say. And understanding the patterns of codependency and like, not just like what it looks like, but how it's playing out in my life and how it feels and the patterns that I myself am directly, enmeshed in. It's taken a long time to really understand that because codependency is so baked into Mormon culture and just like the environment that I grew up in. And this has led me down the path of learning all about attunement and like emotional neglect and projection and just like so much stuff when it comes to relationship. So I was reading through this it's like a little guide, a PDF guide. I don't know if anybody follows Philemon is Alive on Instagram. Great follow if you don't follow him already. He's like a Jungian guy. He like creates these Jungian psychology guides that like break things down and like translate them into English for people who are like, what the hell is Carl Jung talking about? And he has several, and I've purchased several of them and read through them. And in one of them, I can't remember which one, he is talking about how like when we're children, we obviously don't have the ability to understand someone else's reality or someone else's inner world. So like if your parent is like stressed, you don't think like, oh, my mom is stressed. You just interpret whatever's happening through like the subtle layers of your body and your awareness that the world is stressful or like reality itself is stressful. Or it's like, let's say that, it can even be things like, let's say a parent has to go to the hospital, like a hospital stay for an extended amount of time or whatever. Or there's some sense of being left. You can't reason. You can't be like, oh, this is what's happening. You just interpret it as like, oh, I am alone. And like, I am alone in the world. Or, this can happen in all different ways. And it's something that's like inevitable, I think it can happen to varying degrees. Obviously, some people have much more healthy emotional relationships and connections in their childhood than others. But I think it's kind of like a universal experience, just because we all come into the world as babies and we don't, we can't reason. We can't make sense of these things. And so even if you had parents who were attuned to you, there is still some level of this that is going to happen where you develop your perception of, reality based on just how you're interpreting through your little infant body or toddler body what's happening around you. And obviously without the ability to see things objectively. And then a lot of that gets turned into shame, of course. It's like for some reason when we come into the world, we're just like, anything that happens to us, we're like, this is my fault. This is happening because I am bad. I'm like, why is that our default? Like, why does everyone default to that? It seems like. Anyway, so then if you add on top of that, like a parent who wasn't attuned, or, you know, some type of trauma or emotional neglect or whatever, things become obviously much more complicated, the experience in the body is much more severe. And the, what do you call it? The coping mechanisms and the like patterns that the mind, you know, like it's strategies that it will follow and like develop in order to repress and bury and protect against these experiences and to like defend against this experience that we're having. It's like those strategies, those coping strategies and defense mechanisms become really, really intense and really rigid. And, you know, that's when you start to get to the point where it's like you kind of have like a split psyche. And this is like a complicated thing to talk about. And I'm not like a psychologist and I don't, whatever, but it's like the greater the need for repression, there tends to be like a higher level of defenses and, you know, systematic, like you're blocking, you know, you're burying what's happening. You're splitting off from it. I think about my own experience in Mormonism, and it's been really confusing for me to understand because Mormonism is so like fluffy, right? Everything on the surface is so just like love and light and like Jesus is, you know, everything's good and we're happy and whatever. And my parents are really wonderful, which I have mentioned before. And they gave a lot of attention, a lot of care. You know, I wouldn't look at my childhood and be like, oh, I felt like I was emotionally neglected, or I wouldn't, you know, there's nothing that I can point to where I'm, you know, noticing these like traumatic experiences in the way that I was cared for by my caregivers. And nonetheless, I still have all these symptoms of like emotional neglect or like these abandonment wounds or whatever it might be. And I think part of this is because, like I was saying before, it's kind of a universal experience. It's kind of something that like, it's a little bit inevitable, you know, that we're all going to experience this to some degree, you know. But I think another reason why I feel like I have all of the symptoms of emotional neglect or abandonment or whatever is because of Mormonism. It's because there is a weird disconnect that happens where there's like a lot that's happening on the surface where they're almost like playing out these roles. It's like they're pretend playing. But underneath the surface, there's a lot more happening, a lot more that's unconsciously happening that is being ignored and buried. And it's like if your caregivers are doing that in themselves, like let's say, you know, you come from generations of Mormonism. And even if you're not Mormon, you know, it's like generations before us, it's just like, you know, people were incredibly emotionally repressed and disconnected and whatever, you know, it's like that is a very common experience for adults and human beings in the last however many hundreds of years. And so you come from a lot of people who didn't necessarily know what emotional intelligence even was. They didn't know what attunement was. Like they themselves didn't receive it. And so then, you know, in my experience in Mormonism, it's like you have this community of like love and light and peace and joy, and we all take care of each other and Jesus and whatnot. But then underneath that, no one has acknowledged their own abandonment wounds. No one has acknowledged their own attachment wounds. No one has acknowledged like their trauma. You know, no one has acknowledged anything. And you pile that on top of the fact that like in Christianity, there's this fear of Satan. There's this fear of anything that they believe comes from Satan, which in reality is just a fear of like one half of being a human being. It's one half of existence. It's a fear of yourself. It's a fear of your own shadow, a fear of your own anger, whatever it might be, your anger, your sexuality, like whatever Christianity is kind of like, oh, like that's a carnal human body thing. And like, you gotta, you know, protect yourself against that. So then you have your caregivers who are attending to themselves in this way, where they can't even fully attune to themselves because they have these beliefs that like half of what they're experiencing in their body is bad or wrong or dangerous. And so then how are they supposed to be able to attune to you? They can't. There's not this like I was talking to a friend the other day and she was talking to me about like what it felt like to grow up securely attached. I was like, you're the only person I've ever met. You are a unicorn. Like, tell me, what was it like? And she said that her parents, they just felt like they were just delighted to see who she was and just delighted to let her like blossom into herself. And there was so much room for like exploration and play and self-discovery, and nobody was enmeshed with each other's emotions, and nobody felt like a weird codependency thing going on, and they were like able to truly attune to her. And, I compare that to my experience in Mormonism, and I'm curious how many people can relate to this. Growing up in like a high demand religion, it's like even if you have parents who can give you a lot of love and care and attention, it's not the same thing as attunement if there is a strict boundary about what type of person you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to show up in the world. There's not the safety that you need to actually explore who you are or for them to really mirror back to you yourself. And so then what happens is this is like the breeding grounds for codependency. Because you didn't get the proper attunement. And so you didn't have yourself, like your own emotions, your own internal world mirrored back to you. So then you either start to like enmesh with your caregivers, or you start to become like very avoidant. You start to become very avoidant when it comes to intimacy or whatever. And the process begins in childhood and carries into adulthood. And what's been fascinating about this to me, at least in my own process, is I didn't realize how many of my issues or problems in life, even my like health issues, stem from these attachment wounds and this deep sense of codependency. I had no idea, because you can't see the pattern when you're in it. And it's not until you start to get out of it that you're like, oh, I can't believe I was living that way. And this friend that I was referring to, her name's Dara, she has these transmissions that she does. Like she records these, they're not meditations, they're like transmissions. And she has this whole recording that's about attachment wounds. And she goes through like your root chakra and your sacral and your solar plexus and your heart and your throat. And she's like, okay, we're basically going to address all of the experiences that you did not receive in childhood that were required for developing secure attachment with your caregivers and therefore with yourself and with life and reality itself. And she talks about like the need for safety, feeling safe, emotional attunement, a feeling of joy and delight, just like delight in existing and in, other people being delighted in your existence. Your ability to express, like be creative and fully express yourself. And she goes through all these things in much more detail than I'm going through here. And when I was listening to it the first time, I was like, it didn't even dawn on me how much I didn't get what I needed in childhood because, like I said, everything on the surface in Mormonism is just so fluffy. I couldn't recognize what was missing in my own experience until I met someone like Dara who was living on the other side of that and could be like, oh, this is what you didn't receive. And like, this is how it feels in your body to actually feel securely attached. Like it changes your self-perception into a positive one, which I was like, what? I can't even fathom. I think a lot of people, like, if you were to ask me, I would never be like, oh, I have a poor self-perception. You know what I mean? Like I never identified as somebody who was carrying a lot of shame. Because like, my family, we're all like really like productive, like successful, and like we can like make things happen, and like we believe in ourselves and we follow our dreams and whatever. And so I was kind of just like, yeah, like I don't have shame, And then like the more inner work I did, I was just like, oh, I have so much shame. There's so much shame in there. And I think that's common for a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's more common than we realize for people to just be carrying around a lot of shame, even if they can't see it. It's like what I was talking about earlier, where the psyche goes to great lengths to protect us from the pain that we experienced, to basically bury it and hide it from our own view. But I was just like a positive self-perception, like it's not that I have like a horrific health, self-expression, but then like when I really am honest with myself, and I like drop into my body and I'm really feeling like the deep core, like Marion Woodman, if anybody knows who that is, she's a Jungian psychologist. She has this analogy where she says that people are like donuts. And I think about this all the time because she says we circle and we circle and we circle around our core wounds, the hole in us, like the void, until eventually something happens in life. It's usually something very traumatic or, life forces us to go into the hole of the donut and look at the void, look at the darkness. And this is how I feel about this part of me, like this deeply internalized shame. That is like the center of the donut, right? That's the center of the core of me. It's like there's this darkness, and I apologize if this is sounding bleak, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that can relate. Like when you really get honest with yourself and you're not like trying to hold yourself out of it. It's like, I remember after I left the church and I started therapy and I was working with this guy who, was really connecting me to my body for the first time. And I dropped into my body really like fully. And I was like, oh, I'm like, this is what it feels like in here. I'm like, oh, this is bad. This is really bad. Like, there is demons in here. There is like a weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, So the more that I got really honest with myself, all of this that I'd been learning about this, like, the hole in the center of the donut and like this internalized shame and whatever, it all was like, oh yeah, like I am experiencing this. Like I'm not different from everybody else. You know what I mean? I am also experiencing this type of like wounding inside of me. And the more work that I've done, the more that I realize that so much of it comes back to attachment wounding. So much of it comes back to early childhood. And, you could even get into like generational trauma and like what happens in like birth trauma or like when you're in utero, and all that stuff can also play into it. So when I was talking to Dara about like, being securely attached or having like a positive self-image, it was kind of mind-blowing to me to just the thought of being able to like drop into your body and be like, I feel great in here, like I believe in myself and I am delighted in my own existence, like that felt so foreign to me. And the thing that I've noticed in my own life is that when this is not addressed, when these like core wounds, the center of the donut is not addressed, it will manifest in your life. And for a lot of people, it manifests in their relationships, myself included. And going back to Philemon is Alive, another one of his guides that I was reading through talks about the myth of the magical other. And the myth of the magical other, this was like a term coined by some Jungian psychologists, all my Jungian nerds out there. I can't remember who it was it Hollis? I can't remember. It's basically this idea that what is unconscious will be projected onto our romantic partners. I mean, it gets projected onto everything, external, but especially it will show up in our romantic relationships. And this is where you get the entire culture of quote unquote romance. And should I go down this like rabbit hole with this? I have so many thoughts on the culture of romance that I could deeply go into. But what I will just say for now is that much of what we call romance is just projection. Much of what we call love is actually just our unconscious attachment wounds, our unconscious childhood unmet needs being projected onto this magical other. that we believe is going to complete us or to save us. And in his guide, he calls it, he talks about how the psyche hates a vacuum. The psyche hates a void, right? It hates like a blank space. And so you see someone and you think that you know them, like you're connecting with them and you're like, wow, this person is amazing. And you think that you really know who they are, but especially in the beginning, you obviously don't. And your psyche fills in the blanks with everything that it wants this person to be. It fills in the blanks with all of the unmet childhood needs, the fantasy of like, this person is exactly what I've been looking for to heal all of my childhood wounds. And obviously this is all happening unconsciously. And this isn't to like pathologize, falling in love or getting attached to people or whatever. There's just a completely different type of love or quote unquote romance that arises when we aren't projecting our past onto the person in front of us. And often what happens when we project the past onto the person in front of us is what A Course in Miracles, and this is a very controversial book. So many people hate this book. I'm sorry, guys. I love it. So in A Course in Miracles, they call it a special love that turns into special hate. And so this happens a lot in quote unquote romance, where it's like, this person completes me and this person is blah, 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 blah. And then that same person has the ability to fill you with rage, and it's like, if they leave you or they don't do what you want or they whatever, then all of a sudden this person that you love so much, you hate with like every ounce of your being more than you've hated anyone. And A Course in Miracles talks about how this isn't love because love has no opposite, but it's just something else entirely that's happening. And this is why this process of like, quote unquote, falling in love or like finding your soulmate or whatever it is so captivating and like all encompassing. It's like it almost sends you into this like weird type of psychosis, It's like you lose all your boundaries and you just like, you want to just like merge with this other person, right? Because in reality, you're seeking in the other person this wholeness. You're seeking a sense of union that can only be found in yourself, that was not mirrored back to you, like that was not given to you in childhood. So you never developed the capacity to have like your own internal world that was whole and complete. And to take this even a step further, and this is very true for myself, when it comes to attachment wounds, to me, it's the exact same thing as the God wound. If you think about like Christian God, especially, you're essentially like, we're doing the same thing that we do with this like myth of the magical other. We do the same thing with this concept of God, where it's like, I'm going to project everything that my parents didn't give to me. And it's not, no shade to the parents, right? Like I'm a parent, my kids are going to say the same thing about me. A lot of times when I read like all this stuff online right now, it's very popular to be like, my parents fucked me up. Like, yeah, fuck the parents. And I'm like, oh shit, like that's going to be me. Like my kids are going to say it about me, like, so I just had to throw that in there. Like, it's just a process that we all engage in as being human and being imperfect people. So going back to what I was saying, if you think about like, oh, my parents didn't give me this, my parents didn't give me that, this is the attunement that I need, whatever, blah, blah, blah. You project all of that onto this idea of God, or a lot of people do it onto this like idea of Jesus too, which Jesus is like a whole separate topic, but it's like, he's very symbolic of, he holds a lot of people's projections as well. And so my experience of like working through my attachment wounds, I haven't been able to separate them from the God wound, from this feeling that I was like abandoned by God or forgotten by God or not loved by God, or like I'm in this weird codependent situation with God where I have to perform and obey. And like, he's actually just kind of like a real angry son of a bitch. And if I don't do things right, he's going to be really upset. And this constant feeling of like, why don't you love me? Why am I not good enough? Why don't you choose me? All of those things. So the process for me of healing my attachment wounds is very, very existential. it feels much bigger than just like, oh, my parents, they were doing the best they could and it was just like, wasn't quite enough. It feels much more like, it's like I'm trying to reach wholeness, but I was trying to do it through this weird symbol of this like codependent Mormon God. And when you talk about God, for me, God is synonymous with wholeness. I think what we are trying to find, at least for myself, is this sense of union, this sense of wholeness, like I was talking about. And we seek it everywhere except for in ourselves, because we live on Earth in separate bodies, in a physical reality. And we do not feel, at least me, naturally connected to this sense of wholeness. We're seeking wholeness in other people, whether it be God, our parents, our friendships, our romantic partners, whatever it is. We want that feeling of union and wholeness. And once again, this isn't to pathologize like the need for relationship or the need for connection, but there is something different that arises when you work through this process in yourself, when you address these wounds and this core, the whole of the donut. When you address it in yourself, it creates more space for actual love and actual connection. It's so confusing because there's so many different messages about like, we need each other. Like we are relational beings, and like we're supposed to be in community. And like, it's like, of course it's natural of like, this is like the most human thing on the planet, to want connection and to want community and to want to belong. But there's like a whole other thing at play when we talk about relationships, a whole other codependent thing at play in society when we talk about relationships and connection. There's this woman that I go to, her name is Shane. She's an intuitive. She's a Lakota woman. She's half Lakota, half German. And I found her like back in 2021. I went through I was just leaving the church and I was going through this phase where I was like going to all the intuitives. I was like, I'm going to go to all the psychics. Like I went like very Mormon to like very new age, which was very dangerous and very bad. But it was like this phase that I was in where I was like, I am going to go to all the psychics, right? So I ended up finding Shane. And the first time I had a reading with her, an intuitive reading, I was like, oh, like I was like in tears. It was so beautiful. But one of the things, the reason that I'm saying all of this is because one of the calls that I had with her recently is she was like, when you're creating relationship, whether it be romantic or otherwise, how can you know what you want to create or that you're creating what you want to if you're working with old material? Meaning, if the only patterns and maps that you've been given for relationship are codependent ones or enmeshed ones or whatever the hell society is doing, how can you create a new paradigm of relationship if you're working with old material? If you can't even fully see the material that you're working with? There's so much narrative around relationship. And the secret thing that's happening under the surface is that nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but a lot of people are not addressing the materials that they're working with unconsciously. So really what they're doing is they're coming from the lens of, I'm going to project my past onto you. I'm going to see my past in you and make you responsible for it unconsciously. I'm going to continue the paradigm of codependency that I can't see because I haven't addressed my own hole in the donut. I haven't addressed my own deeply internalized shame. I have not taken responsibility for it. I have not fully individuated. So I'm going to unconsciously make all of the people that I'm in relationship with responsible for that. And I'm going to call that love. If you can be responsible for my deepest, darkest pain that I'm putting on you unconsciously, then that means you love me. And if you can't, then you don't love me. And so when we say like we need relationship, yes. But once you begin to address your own deepest, darkest shame and pain and attachment wounds, there's a different way of relating that begins to come through. And you realize that this paradigm of romance, this paradigm of however we're approaching relationships, a majority of people in society, is very limiting to actual, like, capital L love. It's very limiting to actual connection. And Dara always talks about this too. You know, she's like, as long as you're coming from a place of lack, your relationships will always be codependent. And in my mind, I'm like, I can't fathom not coming from a place of lack. Like, is that a joke? Like, I'm just supposed to feel whole by myself? Like, that sounds absolutely insane. Like, don't we need each other? Like, aren't we relational beings and whatever and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yes, that is true. But the connection, the foundation of having a connection to wholeness and union within yourself, that becomes the foundation for connection and wholeness and union with everyone else. And I just know this from personal experience that even if my partner does all the right things, even if the people in my life check all the boxes of like, I'm going to hold space for your anxious attachment and I'm going to do this for you and I'm going to validate you all day long and I'm going to blah, 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 blah. It will never feel like it's enough for me because it's a projection. It's not actually what my soul is seeking. It wants to feel union within myself so that I can come from a place of wholeness and not from a place of lack. And then I can then extend that to other people and be in connection in a completely different way. Like, relating to people this way fosters way more like deeper intimacy, way more like it's like a very clear way of relating. And I talk to this like I'm like doing this. I'm not doing this. I know this in theory and I'm putting it into practice as best as I can. And I'm currently like mid-process of like working through all this stuff myself in therapy. But I can feel it. I can feel like I've felt this like sort of intuitive knowing this whole time. I'm like, it feels like there's a different way to be in relationship that is so much more life-giving than this way that we are kind of like collectively approaching it in society. And one thing that Dara said too that I really loved is, you know, she was talking about kind of the way that we approach relationship. And she's like, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can work. You can be in a relationship that is kind of inherently codependent and it can function well if both people are doing their part or they're really compatible in their whatever their wounds are and they kind of fit together like a puzzle piece and whatever. It can work, but it's just very, very limiting in the amount of love and connection and depth that you are capable of feeling. And that speaks to the truest part of my soul. So now it feels like I've maybe just kind of like shit all over romance and like, you know, I feel like it can sound a little pathologizing or like it's like promoting like hyper independence, right? Like it's just like you got to fix your problems yourself and like don't need other people because that makes you weak or, you know, whatever. But I was talking to a friend the other day and she was mentioning how in the process of like healing attachment wounding, you are also a person that you need to be connected with. And it all depends on, you know, how you look at connection, how you look at being quote unquote separate. The feeling of connection, this feeling of union that we all like, we have this natural drive for, and it's good and it's healthy, like this need for relating. We are incredibly limited in where we think we can get that. It's like it can also come from yourself. You are a person that you can connect to and attach to. And not only people, but also the earth. The earth is a person. If anybody is into animism or like, you know, subscribes to any of that, like I am huge, like into all of that. It's like the earth is a being that you can attach to. And then if you get into more of like the Buddhist perspective, which is my friend Dara, awareness itself is attuning to you. And there is no separation. There is wholeness everywhere. This all sounds beautiful, right? You should see me trying to put these things into practice. I recently started doing EMDR, and it's actually been helping a lot. You know, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's like crazy how much you can be consciously aware of something, and yet your brain or your psyche or whatever will go to great lengths to block your ability to access it in your body. It's one thing to be like, oh yeah, I grew up Mormon and I have these attachment wounds because of this, and I didn't get this and this happened to me. But in order to really attune to it in your body and access it in your body, for me, usually requires some sort of altered state of consciousness, whether that be psychedelics or EMDR or something that will get you into the body, into like an altered state of consciousness. Because my brain, it's just so split. It's so split off. The unconscious is so unconscious that a lot of times I don't even know what's happening there, and instead it will just manifest in physical symptoms. I was listening to this podcast episode recently that a friend sent to me by Daniel Brown. He is someone who has worked with a lot of, he's done a lot of work around attachment theory. And he was talking about how if you can access the memory of your trauma, like you cognitively understand what happened to you, but there's no emotion attached to it, or you can't access in your body fully how it affected you, then that's a form of dissociation. And that trauma resolution doesn't really occur until we can access in the body how it actually affected us. Another thing that he mentioned that I thought was super fascinating is how in all of his research and working with clients and patients and whatnot, he noticed this pattern that it was not beneficial to work through someone's trauma with them before addressing their attachment wounds. And that if somebody had like a traumatic experience and you tried to dive into that and go into that and work through that with them, that it actually made them more dysregulated and more disoriented if he didn't first work with their attachment wounds. So it was the ability to feel securely attached to yourself or to life or to whatever that allowed them the container that they needed to then work through their trauma. And this has been also true in my life where it's like so many times, people are like, oh, you gotta go into the body. You gotta see what's in there. Like you gotta feel it to heal it. You gotta address everything that your body's repressing. And I'm like, okay, let's go. Like, let's do it. I'm ready. And it just felt like perpetually ripping off a Band-Aid of something that was trying to heal over and over and over again because I lacked the proper inner resourcing. I lacked secure attachment to myself. And so there was no safe container for the ripping off of the Band-Aid. And it would just leave me more dysregulated and more confused and more unable to function. And what I find so fascinating about religion as well, like experiencing cult abuse, is that your ability to feel securely attached gets directly intertwined with the belief system. So like, for example, since I have left Mormonism, there's been many, many times where they're like, okay, like let's find your safe space. Go to your safe space in your body. And I'm like, the safe space is no longer safe. The safe space that I developed was directly connected to Mormonism. And so when I left, the safe space disappeared. And then they'd be like, oh, well, you just got to separate. You got to separate, your actual sense of safety, your actual sense of self from the church. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let me just do that real quick. Like I couldn't just easily make that transition of separating what was mine and what was the church's. Or sometimes they'll do this thing where they're like, you got to reparent yourself. You got to be your own loving inner parent. And I'm like, okay, so I go into my body and I'm like trying to offer myself this thing that I felt like I didn't get, whatever attunement that I need or whatever. And my whole system, like all of my parts just reject me. They're like, we don't want you because you're not God, according to, these parts of me. It's like these younger inner child parts. They're like, they were taught that attunement and safety and care and all that comes from God. And so when they see me and they're like, yeah, I'm just attuning to you, they're like, fuck you, bitch. Like, we don't want you. Like, you're not God. So it's been really difficult to heal my own attachment wounds because all of that like securely attached material, like what's required for that, was directly intertwined with Mormonism. And that is what I call spiritual abuse. So all of this being said, knowing all of this philosophically or intellectually is way different than actually being integrated. And what I have found is that you can know all the things intellectually, but your relationships and your daily life, your shadow, like what is not yet integrated, will play out in those scenarios, which might seem like a pain in the ass that you can know so many things in theory, but it's like whatever it is that's making you feel like you know so much, maybe you're like, oh, I'm so enlightened, I know all these things, or like I have my fancy degree or whatever it is. The daily grind of like working through your relationships and the scenarios that present themselves to you with your family, with your romantic partners, with your job, whatever it is, those are the things that you really should pay attention to. Because that is where the unconscious will manifest. That is where your shadow will be mirrored back to you. That is where everything that is not yet integrated in you, regardless of what you know intellectually, will stare you in the eye. And that has definitely been the truth for myself. So it's helpful to know all these things so that when stuff comes up, you can sort of have a framework to recognize, okay, where am I on the map? Where am I in this process of like individuating? But then from there, it is then your responsibility to apply that in a real situation so that you don't just keep repeating the same patterns over and over and over again in all of your relationships. And this work is incredibly difficult. It's a lot of facing like your deepest, darkest demons and looking at parts of yourself that you don't want to see and admitting things to yourself that you don't want to admit and being radically honest with yourself about how you're showing up, how you're lying to yourself, how you're not being honest with other people, how you're taking advantage of people, what you're doing that is not in alignment. And it takes a lot of like accountability and a lot of willingness to stop externalizing, stop looking out there and trying to fix the people out there, and instead looking inside of yourself and recognizing where you're abandoning yourself. And this can be a complicated thing to talk about, especially for Mormon, like ex-Mormon women, and I think just women in general, or anyone regardless of gender who has a propensity to kind of like make everything their fault. And to be like, oh, if I just fix this and this and this about myself, then the relationship will be better. And this is why it's so important to deeply address your attachment wounds so that you don't have some unconscious thing that's playing out that's trying to keep you in a situation that's actually not good for you, or that's making you overcompensate, or that's making you feel responsible for things that actually aren't yours. And I think, Dara has the course that I was telling you guys about, the transmission, she calls it, I want to say it's something about like the cosmology of the awakened body. And there's a lot of talk in spirituality, or in spiritual circles about like awakening, right? And like having a spiritual awakening or whatever. And I'm like, I don't know what that means fully. That could mean a lot of different things. But I'm like, to me, it almost just feels like the ability, like living in an awakened body feels like the ability to not just be reenacting your past. It feels like being clear. Like nothing is just, it's like there's nothing about you that is hidden from you. And that's like, of course, there's going to be things that are hidden from you, right? Like we contain multitudes, we are mysteries. But it's like you are clear enough in your mind and in your mind-body connection that you're not just acting out your past. And that feels like a feat, like that feels like a lot of work, but it also feels achievable to me, especially if you know how to go there. I'm going to go into this more in future episodes, like working with altered states, and as well as like dream work. Dream work has been huge for me. And then just like, like what it actually means, what it actually feels like to be individuating, to be working through your trauma, but not just in a purely Western lens. I was reading this quote today from Jung, and he talks about how, in his view, like therapy, philosophy, psychology, and spirituality, like all of that should not be divided, that they were all like deeply intertwined and interconnected. And that when we try to like separate them, we miss like the bigger picture of what's actually happening inside of us. So I plan to talk about like my own healing process through a lot of different lenses, not just like a purely Western therapy, trauma healing, psychological perspective. Okay, thank you guys for listening. I hope I didn't sound too, pathologizing of all your romance desires. Go listen to your Taylor Swift album and just get lost in your fantasies. And just a reminder, I am not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not anything. I do hair. You guys, I guess you could say hairstylists are like therapists in a lot of ways, but I don't have any fancy schmancy training. I am just sharing my own process and hoping to create connection and hoping that it resonates for people and to just create a sense of, maybe we're not so alone in the things that we're going through. And if you want more content or more of my thoughts, you can find me on Instagram or TikTok, Stephanie Ann again. Okay, thank you.